On September 4, 2024, Rosemary Johnson had been tending to her home, her family, and her routines for decades. For nearly 60 years, she had offered guidance, shared laughter, and created a sanctuary in her Cape Coral residence. Every morning, her voice carried through the hallways, reminding her grandchildren to be careful, sharing stories that shaped their young minds, offering wisdom to her children. But that night, the words she had spoken for a lifetime would never sound the same. They would echo through memory as a haunting reminder of what was lost, of the ordinary life abruptly shattered by a horror no one could have predicted. That evening began like any other. The lights glimmered softly through the windows, casting familiar shadows across the furniture that had witnessed generations of family life. Rosemary moved through her home with practiced grace, unaware that Devin Bryant Johnson, her 32-year-old son, carried intentions far beyond reconciliation or familial dispute. 4 weeks, 4 months, tensions had simmered unnoticed by neighbors and community alike. Devin's history of aggression, his escalating frustrations, and the unresolved conflicts within the family had been warning signs, quietly accumulating, waiting for the moment to explode. Within the house, the scene was intimate and ordinary. The hum of appliances, the creak of floors beneath weary feet, the soft conversations of a mother checking in on her children. Outside, the night air held a quiet calm, the neighborhood unaware that inside, a nightmare was approaching. Devin had reportedly armed himself, prepared to enact violence in a way that would leave permanent scars on everyone involved. Every step he took inside that home was a calculated intrusion into the life of the woman who had nurtured him, guided him, and protected him for more than 3 decades. As events unfolded, Rosemary confronted a reality that defied comprehension. The son she had raised, who should have been her support and protector, became the source of the ultimate betrayal. Every moment became a struggle for survival, her instinct to shield her grandchildren clashing with the brutal intent directed at her. The chaos, the fear, and the terror of that night are impossible to fully convey, yet they define the tragic culmination of a lifetime of family bonds turned to unimaginable violence. Even as the night concluded with the authorities arriving, the echoes of what occurred linger. Questions persist. How could such rage grow within a household? How did warning signs go unnoticed? What might have been done to prevent a mother's voice, the guidance and warmth that had shaped generations, from being silenced forever? You're watching Bruised Voice. Hit the like button, subscribe, and turn on notifications. Every like and subscription amplifies the stories of victims who can no longer speak. Tell us where you're watching from in the comments, and remember that the ordinary routines of life can hide the extraordinary danger that sometimes exists within those we trust most. On any ordinary day, Rosemary Johnson moved through her Cape Coral home with the quiet strength of someone who had spent decades nurturing a family and maintaining the rhythm of daily life. At 59, she was the anchor for her children and grandchildren, a woman whose laughter carried through the hallways, whose words offered guidance, and whose presence created a sense of security in a world that often felt unpredictable. To those who knew her, she was a figure of unwavering devotion, a grandmother who remembered birthdays, a mother who had weathered trials with patience, and a neighbor whose friendliness was extended to anyone who crossed her path. Her life was defined not by the extraordinary but by the care she poured into ordinary moments. School lunches prepared, homework checked, evening walks taken with grandchildren, and the gentle reminders that family always mattered most. Every morning, the house filled with the quiet sounds of domestic life. The hum of the refrigerator, the distant chime of a doorbell, the soft footsteps of children moving about their routines. Rosemary's devotion was not just a private affair. She had built relationships across the community. Friends would stop by for a cup of coffee or advice. Neighbors relied on her wisdom in times of dispute, and her grandchildren sought her counsel in the small crises of growing up. Her home, a sanctuary of warmth and stability, was also a reflection of her personal philosophy, that family, love, and attentiveness formed the backbone of a life well lived. Yet even as she cultivated these connections and managed the household, forces were at work that would transform that sanctuary into a scene of tragedy. Devin Bryant Johnson, her 32-year-old son, existed within this family landscape as a source of persistent tension. Public records and family accounts describe a pattern of aggression and domestic disputes that had escalated over the years. Reports from neighbors and relatives speak to incidents in which Devin's anger and frustration manifested physically or verbally, hinting at the turbulence beneath the surface of what appeared to be a normal suburban family. Despite these warning signs, the full extent of his resentment and potential for violence remained obscured, understood only in retrospect after the events that would devastate his family. Devin's relationship with his mother was complex. It mixed familial loyalty and filial obligation with underlying tension, a struggle for control, and a dynamic in which small conflicts often reflected deeper issues of entitlement and frustration. In the societal context of Cape Coral, Florida, Rosemary's household existed within a tightly knit network of community expectations and norms. The city, with its blend of family-oriented neighborhoods and active community engagement, provided both social support and an informal system of oversight. Neighbors noted altercations, the sound of raised voices, and moments of unease that punctuated otherwise ordinary days. Rosemary attempted to leverage every tool at her disposal to maintain security and order, installing locks, employing alarms, and calling authorities when she perceived threats to her safety. Yet, even as she demonstrated vigilance, the escalation of her son's aggression outpaced the measures she could realistically take, and the presence of history and access allowed Devin to internalize grievances that would culminate in a catastrophic act. The family dynamics, the intersection of loyalty, disappointment, and unresolved conflict, set the stage for a tragedy that was both intimate and horrifying. Rosemary's grandchildren, completely reliant on her guidance and protection, witnessed the slow accumulation of tension in a household where familial bonds had become intertwined with control and resentment. Friends and neighbors, though aware of certain disputes, could not fully anticipate the depth of Devin's planning or the immediacy of the threat he posed. Publicly, Rosemary maintained the routine of a devoted mother and grandmother, while privately she navigated a landscape fraught with anxiety, alert to the simmering danger that existed within her own family. Every aspect of Rosemary's life, from the roles she inhabited to the precautions she took, contributes to a portrait of a woman defined by care, attentiveness, and resilience. She exemplified the everyday heroism found in those who work to safeguard loved ones against forces that are often invisible until it is too late. Her steps in the home, the gentle guidance she offered, and the unassuming rhythms of her life are starkly contrasted with the violent trajectory her son had cultivated, a juxtaposition that underscores the horror of what would come. Each interaction with Devin, each moment of apparent disagreement, carried with it a shadow of escalating risk that, tragically, would find its expression in the events that unfolded on that fateful night. The community, accustomed to seeing Rosemary as a pillar of stability and warmth, now faces the disorienting task of reconciling that image with the shocking realities of familial violence. Her story is not merely a record of a single household but a reflection of broader societal tensions. The challenge of recognizing escalating domestic aggression, the limitations of intervention, and the fragility of perceived safety in environments where trust is both essential and vulnerable. In examining her life, it becomes clear that the ordinary routines, the daily acts of care, and the commitments to family formed a world that, while seemingly secure, contained undercurrents of risk that were tragically underestimated. Devin's psychological profile, as documented through reports of past behavior, demonstrates a pattern of entitlement, aggression, and an inability to navigate relational conflict without resorting to intimidation or violence. These characteristics, observable over years and in multiple contexts, offer insight into how domestic grievances escalated into premeditated action. Publicly accessible information notes prior police interactions, complaints, and neighborhood observations that paint a picture of a young man who, despite living within the care and oversight of his family, cultivated resentment and focused aggression toward those closest to him. Each argument, each disagreement, became part of an internal narrative that ultimately justified a violent resolution in his mind. Even as Rosemary provided for her family, offered guidance to her grandchildren, and contributed to her community, Devin's growing pattern of aggression operated largely unnoticed or insufficiently mitigated. The systemic gaps, the reliance on informal oversight, and the assumptions of ordinary family dynamics allowed for an accumulation of risk that would ultimately manifest in a catastrophic event. Friends, neighbors, and local authorities were witnesses to smaller incidents that, in isolation, appeared manageable. Taken collectively, they were pieces of a puzzle that, tragically, would only be understood fully in the aftermath. Family support networks, cultural expectations, and societal norms in Cape Coral shaped both Rosemary's responses and the community's perception of her household. She sought to resolve conflict with empathy, mediation, and vigilance, but within these well-intentioned frameworks existed the reality of a son whose internalized frustrations were increasingly focused on control and dominance. Her diligence in maintaining routines, instilling moral guidance, and safeguarding her children could not anticipate the sudden and extreme escalation that would culminate in a fatal act. Despite the vigilance, despite decades of providing care and maintaining a household grounded in trust and attentiveness, Rosemary's life was overshadowed by the presence of a family member capable of orchestrating lethal violence. The narrative of her life, public and private, is intertwined with lessons about the unpredictability of domestic conflict, the critical importance of recognizing early warning signs, and the devastating consequences when intervention is either delayed or insufficient. And yet, even in the shadow of these realities, the story of Rosemary Johnson illuminates the ways in which human devotion, familial commitment, and societal bonds coexist with the potential for tragedy. Each day she spent offering guidance, each moment spent nurturing, reinforces the cruel contrast between ordinary domestic life and the extraordinary violence that would abruptly intrude upon it. Her attentiveness, her laughter, her steady presence, all become benchmarks against which the incomprehensible actions of her son, Devin Bryant Johnson, are measured. The persistence of normalcy, the emphasis on routine and care, and the deeply ingrained human behaviors of protection and empathy form a stark backdrop to the darkness of escalating aggression. Rosemary's interactions with her family, her engagement in the community, and her dedication to the stability of her household are central to understanding both the emotional weight of the tragedy and the societal context in which it occurred. Despite her vigilance, her careful routines, and her deep commitment to family, no one anticipated that the domestic space she maintained as a haven would become the setting for a horror that would shatter the lives of everyone within it, and leave the community grappling with questions about warning signs, intervention, and the fragility of trust within familial bonds. Rosemary Johnson, 59, mother to Devin Bryant Johnson and grandmother to 2 young grandchildren, had spent the afternoon tending to routine household matters. She had cooked dinner, checked the homework of the children, and ensured that the home remained orderly and safe. Neighbors recall the warmth that exuded from Rosemary, a woman devoted to her family, a stabilizing presence in the neighborhood. Meanwhile, Devin Bryant Johnson, 32, moved through the same house with a growing sense of agitation. Over the years, multiple minor domestic incidents had been reported by neighbors and family. Records indicate that Devin had a history of aggression, marked by occasional altercations, threatening behavior, and moments of hostility toward his mother. On this particular evening, those tendencies escalated, though outwardly, it seemed like a normal domestic routine. Rosemary had been aware of Devin's past behavior. She had implemented protective measures, double-checked locks on doors, ensured the children were accounted for, and stayed vigilant to signs of escalation. Despite her efforts, Devin's mind had already begun focusing on the plan he would execute that night. Public accounts suggest that in previous months he had threatened family members, exhibiting a sense of entitlement and control that only intensified as arguments and disputes unfolded. His attention to detail, the planning, and the methodical way he considered his actions would make the night particularly tragic. Neighbors in Cape Coral, accustomed to the occasional disagreements in the Johnson home, had observed unusual behaviors earlier that day. The children were restless, distracted by the tension in the household, and Rosemary attempted to maintain her usual demeanor, offering care, discipline, and calm guidance. The family's outward appearance of normalcy belied the storm gathering inside. As the evening wore on, Devin's frustration and resentment continued to grow. Accounts from public sources indicate he may have been pacing, checking exits, and maintaining a mental rehearsal of the sequence he would later follow. Rosemary remained unaware of the immediacy of the threat. Her focus was on keeping the household safe, nurturing her grandchildren, and preparing for bedtime routines. Yet the psychological weight of Devin's intent hung invisibly in the air, a looming presence that would soon erupt into unspeakable violence. The night seemed ordinary, yet Devin had already set the stage for tragedy, and no one in that house could foresee how violently it would unfold. Publicly reported sources confirmed that there had been prior warnings of domestic aggression in the Johnson household. Devin Bryant Johnson had previously been involved in violent disputes, and Rosemary had sought help from law enforcement and social services. Neighbors recount hearing loud arguments, and there were occasions when authorities were called to the residence. Despite these interventions, there were gaps in protection, leaving the family vulnerable. Rosemary attempted to safeguard herself and her grandchildren. She ensured that doors were locked, the children remained in her view, and sensitive items such as kitchen knives were stored securely. Public records show that neighbors were aware of tension but assumed escalation would not reach fatal levels. Social and familial norms sometimes created a false sense of security, and community members did not anticipate the depth of Devin's aggression that night. Throughout the evening, Rosemary continued to interact with her grandchildren, maintaining routines that were familiar and comforting. She engaged in conversations, offered guidance, and tried to impart a sense of normalcy. Public information indicates she had no reason to believe that Devin's actions would culminate in a murderous attack. Her focus remained on protecting the children, a final instinct that would shape the narrative of that night. Even with warnings and precautions, the household tension was reaching a boiling point, unseen by those around them, yet carefully anticipated by Devin. Devin Bryant Johnson entered a state of decisive aggression as the clock approached 11:30 p.m. According to police reports and witness statements, he armed himself with a knife, moving deliberately through the house. Public accounts confirmed that the attack was swift, violent, and concentrated. Rosemary, devoted to protecting her family, attempted to shield her grandchildren. She positioned herself between Devin and the children, holding them close and guiding them toward perceived safety. The psychological terror she faced was compounded by the betrayal inherent in the act. The assailant was her own son. Each moment brought confusion, disbelief, and urgent calculations of survival. Devin's actions were methodical. Public statements indicate he used the knife to strike multiple times, with injuries inflicted on Rosemary and both children. The narrative is punctuated by the children's screams, attempts to hide, and the sensory chaos of a home transformed into a scene of violence. The children's perspective is central to understanding the horror. They witnessed attacks on the person who had nurtured and protected them since birth, a mother now at the mercy of her own son. The attack created physical and psychological havoc. Rosemary's injuries, reported in public sources, were consistent with repeated stabbing, a clear manifestation of Devin's deliberate intent. Objects in the home were disturbed, chairs overturned, household items displaced, further highlighting the chaotic intensity of the assault. Rosemary continued to attempt escape, guiding the children, shielding them, and clinging to hope, while Devin executed his plan. Every heartbeat mattered. Each motion brought Rosemary closer to her final moments, and every decision Devin made reflected a mind resolute in execution. After completing the attack, Devin fled the scene. Publicly reported sources indicate he left the home, confronting law enforcement during the subsequent manhunt. Emergency medical services arrived promptly, securing the scene and attending to the surviving children, who were transported to local hospitals. Rosemary was pronounced dead at the scene, her life extinguished in the sanctity of her home. Neighbors and community members reacted with shock. Police confirmed the sequence of events based on 911 calls, witness testimony, and forensic evidence. The narrative of the attack revealed premeditation, escalation, and psychological distress, both for the perpetrator and the victims. Public accounts describe a neighborhood grappling with grief, disbelief, and the realization that such extreme violence had occurred in what was perceived as a normal suburban home. Even as authorities worked to stabilize the scene and care for the children, the full magnitude of Devin Bryant Johnson's crime became horrifyingly clear, leaving a scar on a community that had never imagined danger could emerge from within a family. The first officers to arrive at the Johnson residence in Cape Coral were met with a scene that defied comprehension. The home, once a sanctuary of family life, now bore the unmistakable signs of violence. Police quickly cordoned off the area, ensuring that no one entered the house while emergency medical services tended to the surviving children. Neighbors, drawn by the flashing lights and the commotion, provided initial statements, describing sounds of struggle, panicked screams, and the chaotic atmosphere they had witnessed from outside the property. Inside the home, investigators were confronted with the aftermath of Devin Bryant Johnson's brutal actions. The layout of the residence, the positioning of furniture, and the placement of objects all told a story of a methodical attack. Blood patterns were meticulously documented, mapping the trajectory and impact of each stab. Every detail, walls splattered, rugs soaked, and items displaced, was recorded to reconstruct the sequence of events. The children, though traumatized, were able to provide fragmented accounts that helped determine the timing and progression of the attack. Investigators treated their statements with extreme care, aware that these words would carry significant weight in understanding both the human and psychological dimensions of the crime. In the days that followed, police gathered physical evidence with precision. The knife used in the attack was recovered and sent to forensic laboratories to verify fingerprints and trace any other markers. Officers collected samples from the blood patterns, cross-referenced the layout of the rooms, and compared these findings with statements from neighbors and family members. Public records indicate that law enforcement also reviewed prior calls for assistance, documenting the history of Devin's aggression and the multiple warnings that had been reported by Rosemary, relatives, and neighbors alike. Interrogations of family members and close contacts revealed a troubling history. Devin's behavior had escalated over months, alternating between calculated manipulation and uncontrolled anger. Family interviews highlighted the tension between him and his mother, revealing disputes over finances, autonomy, and his attempts to assert control over household decisions. Statements collected from extended relatives, friends, and neighbors painted a picture of a man whose aggression had been persistent and escalating, and whose threat potential had been visible long before the fatal night. 911 call recordings, made publicly available by law enforcement sources, were reviewed and analyzed. These recordings captured the fear and urgency in Rosemary's prior attempts to seek help. The tone of her voice, the specificity of her warnings, and the repeated references to Devin's threats underscored the seriousness of the risk. Investigators noted the difficulty in translating prior alerts into preemptive protection, reflecting systemic challenges in domestic violence interventions. Each recording was scrutinized to understand the timing, response, and missed opportunities that might have altered the outcome. Expert commentary from law enforcement officials and domestic violence specialists was incorporated to provide context. Analysts explained patterns consistent with family-perpetrated attacks, highlighting behavioral warning signs such as possessiveness, prior violence, and escalation in threats. Specialists also reviewed the response protocols, identifying gaps in preventive measures and systemic failures that had left Rosemary vulnerable despite her proactive steps to safeguard herself and her grandchildren. The investigation revealed layers of premeditation. Every move Devin made, from the hours leading up to the attack to the execution within the home, indicated deliberate intent. Investigators recognized the psychological dimensions at play, the combination of resentment, control, and obsession that culminated in a lethal outcome. As evidence was pieced together, the timeline of his actions became clearer, revealing a chilling level of calculation and focus. Investigators began to understand the premeditation and chilling intent behind the attack, a realization that the tragedy was not spontaneous but meticulously orchestrated, leaving a community grappling with horror and unanswered questions. Devin Bryant Johnson was apprehended by Cape Coral law enforcement shortly after the tragic events unfolded inside the Johnson residence. The violent rampage that left his mother, Rosemary Johnson, dead and his two young daughters injured had prompted an immediate manhunt. Officers traced Devin's movements in the immediate aftermath, following eyewitness accounts and vehicle descriptions, until he was taken into custody without further incident. The arrest itself, though procedurally straightforward, carried the weight of the gruesome crime scene and the emotional gravity of a family shattered from within. Upon arraignment at the local court, Devin faced multiple charges, including second-degree murder for the fatal stabbing of his mother and 2 counts of second-degree attempted murder for the assault on his children. Bail was denied, reflecting the severity of the crimes and the perceived danger he posed to the community. Court records detail the formal filing of charges, referencing the physical evidence collected at the residence, statements from witnesses, and prior reports of aggressive behavior. The legal framework emphasized both the immediate criminal acts and the documented history of tension and violence within the household, painting a complete picture for the prosecution. Inside the courtroom, the atmosphere was heavy with emotion. Family members and close acquaintances were called to testify, recounting their experiences and observations. Extended relatives described Devin's long-standing disputes with Rosemary, offering insight into his escalating aggression. Neighbors recalled hearing arguments, noting previous domestic disturbances that had prompted calls to authorities. Each testimony reinforced the pattern of hostility and control, providing the jury with a layered understanding of the family dynamic. The voices of those closest to the victims conveyed not only grief but also lingering disbelief that the escalation had culminated in such a catastrophic act. The courtroom also explored the psychological implications of the crime. Experts were brought in to contextualize Devin's behavior, drawing from public records of prior incidents and domestic conflict reports. They discussed warning signs, potential triggers, and the behavioral trajectory that can lead to familial homicide. The analysis underscored the warning signs that were observed by both law enforcement and the community, and how these indicators aligned with the events that transpired on the night of the attack. Prosecutors meticulously presented the timeline, correlating physical evidence, eyewitness statements, and the testimony of first responders. The defense, while constrained by the weight of the evidence, attempted to explore mitigating factors, including the suspect's psychological state and prior family dynamics. Courtroom observers noted the contrast between the chilling details of the crime and the humanizing accounts of Rosemary's daily life, emphasizing the profound betrayal and loss inherent in the case. Throughout the proceedings, the reactions of Samantha's surviving children, though shielded by privacy measures, were implicitly felt in the courtroom. The emotional resonance of their presence and their recovery from injuries weighed heavily on proceedings, reminding all involved that the consequences of domestic violence extend beyond the immediate victim to the next generation. The courtroom braced for revelations that would shock even those who knew the family as testimony unfolded, exposing the depths of familial discord, the calculated nature of the attack, and the tragic consequences of years of unchecked aggression. The immediate hours following the attack left the community of Cape Coral grappling with disbelief and grief. Rosemary Johnson's death sent shockwaves through her neighborhood, as neighbors struggled to comprehend that a family they had known for years had been torn apart from within. Her two surviving children, though treated promptly at local hospitals, bore the weight of witnessing the violence firsthand. Their injuries were expected to heal physically, but the psychological scars, the terror etched into memory, would linger indefinitely. Extended family members were thrust into roles of caregivers, protectors, and mourners all at once. Friends and relatives coordinated support, navigating the dual tasks of attending to the children's immediate needs while processing their own profound sense of loss. The tragedy underscored the fragility of domestic stability and the unseen tensions that can exist behind closed doors. Every relative recalled moments that, in hindsight, hinted at the escalating danger. Arguments, small incidents of aggression, and warning signs that were either dismissed or underestimated. Media coverage began almost immediately, though local residents quickly noted a stark contrast between the intensity of the horror and the brevity of national reporting. Local news outlets detailed the events, emphasizing both Rosemary's life and the actions of Devin Bryant Johnson. Social media platforms became spaces for mourning and reflection, where neighbors, friends, and even strangers shared condolences, memories, and expressions of disbelief. Fundraisers and community initiatives emerged in response, aiming to support the surviving children and provide resources for families affected by domestic violence. Speculation about motives was unavoidable. While the direct reasons for Devin's actions remained officially under investigation, public discussion centered on prior reports of aggression, the history of tension between mother and son, and potential triggers within family dynamics. Experts on domestic violence noted the patterns: repeated incidents, escalating hostility, and missed opportunities for intervention. Conversations across news reports and social media highlighted the gaps in response systems. Calls to authorities, neighbor observations, and prior alerts that, though documented, were insufficient to prevent the catastrophic outcome. Despite the coverage and analysis, the most haunting questions lingered. Could more proactive intervention have changed the outcome? Were the warning signs missed, ignored, or deemed insufficiently urgent? Could law enforcement or social services have acted differently to prevent the escalation? Every reflection returned to the stark reality. The tragedy was now irreversible, and the consequences extended far beyond the immediate family. The questions remain: could intervention have prevented this tragedy, or was this horrific event destined by circumstances ignored for far too long? Rosemary Johnson's story is a stark reminder of the dangers that can exist within a home, even when the people inside are loved and trusted. Her life, devoted to her children and family, was taken violently, leaving behind grief, unanswered questions, and a community struggling to make sense of the horror. The tragedy exposes the gaps in systems meant to protect victims of domestic violence, highlighting the urgent need for awareness, vigilance, and action. Domestic violence is not always visible from the outside. Arguments, previous incidents, or even subtle changes in behavior can signal escalating danger. Rosemary's repeated attempts to safeguard her family, her calls to authorities, and the interventions she sought were not enough to prevent a devastating outcome. Her experience serves as a warning. The consequences of ignored warning signs are real, immediate, and often irreversible. As you reflect on this case, consider the societal responsibility to recognize and respond to threats within families. How many tragedies like Rosemary's could be prevented if neighbors, communities, and authorities acted decisively on early signs? What lessons can be learned from the patterns of behavior exhibited by those who pose danger to their loved ones? The answers are complex, but the urgency is clear. What do you think could have changed the outcome? Were there missed opportunities that could have protected Rosemary and her grandchildren? Could interventions, more robust support networks, or community awareness have altered the trajectory of that night? Your thoughts are crucial in keeping these discussions alive. Share your perspective in the comments, and let's work together to honor the memory of Rosemary Johnson by learning from her story. Every like, share, and comment amplifies the message and brings attention to the silent cries of victims everywhere. Engaging with this story is not just about understanding what happened. It is about advocating for change and ensuring others do not face similar fates. Subscribe to Bruised Voice. Every subscription ensures that the voices of victims like Rosemary Johnson are heard, even when they cannot speak for themselves. Hit the notification bell to stay informed on meticulously sourced true crime stories, in-depth reconstructions, and the sobering realities that these cases reveal. Your engagement transforms awareness into action, helping raise vigilance and prevent future tragedies. The memory of Rosemary Johnson and the courage of those left behind demand that we listen, reflect, and act. This story may have ended, but the lessons it carries are ongoing, waiting for every viewer to acknowledge and carry forward.